The day Loretta Hayes walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse, the rain had already started falling. Not the loud dramatic kind people remembered from movies. Just cold rain. Quiet rain. The kind that made the entire city feel exhausted. She stood beneath the courthouse steps holding a thin brown envelope against her chest while strangers rushed past her carrying umbrellas and unfinished conversations. 30 years of marriage had just ended in less than 12 minutes. No yelling. No emotion. No last-minute apology. Only signatures. Paperwork. And silence. Calvin Hayes didn't even look at her after the judge finalized the divorce. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his expensive navy suit, shook his lawyer's hand, and walked out beside the young blonde woman waiting near the elevators downstairs. Loretta watched them leave together. The woman laughed at something Calvin whispered into her ear. Loretta couldn't hear the joke, but she knew the sound of victory when she heard it. For 30 years she had cooked dinners for Calvin's business clients, balanced accounts for his company, raised their children, handled every holiday gathering, every school emergency, every forgotten responsibility he never had time for. And somehow, by the end of it all, none of it legally belonged to her. The house? In Calvin's name. The investment accounts? Transferred years ago. The company? Never once included her ownership. Even the car she drove every day had been refinanced under his business structure without her realizing what she had signed. By the time her lawyer uncovered everything, it was already too late. Calvin had spent nearly 2 years preparing for the divorce before she ever knew it was coming. 2 years moving assets. 2 years restructuring ownership. 2 years quietly building an exit strategy while still kissing her goodbye every morning before work. Loretta stood in the rain staring at the envelope in her hands. Inside was the final settlement. $22,000. After 30 years. $22,000. And a list of instructions explaining how quickly she needed to vacate the home she helped build. A city bus splashed water across the curb as it passed. Loretta blinked slowly. Then she laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes pain becomes so large your body stops knowing how else to hold it. That night she slept inside a cheap motel outside Atlanta with a flickering hallway. Light and walls thin. Enough to hear strangers arguing. 2 rooms away. She placed the divorce envelope on the bedside table. Beside it sat the only thing she truly cared about losing. A weathered recipe book wrapped in cloth. Her grandmother's handwriting filled every page. Sauces. Seasonings. Family meals. Tiny notes written in the corners beside. Recipes like little messages from another lifetime. More garlic if the peppers are weak. Slow fire only. Food carries memory. Loretta traced her fingers across the cover. Then finally cried. Not for Calvin. Not even for the marriage. She cried because she suddenly realized how completely she had disappeared inside someone else's life. For 30 years she had been useful, helpful, dependable, necessary, but never visible. And now that she was no longer useful, she had been erased. 3 weeks later, Loretta drove through Atlanta with no destination in mind. Her old sedan rattled every time she stopped at a red light. The air conditioning barely worked. She had exactly $21,000 left after paying legal fees and motel expenses. Most people would have protected what remained. Loretta didn't know why she stopped in front of the abandoned restaurant on Edgewood Avenue. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe exhaustion. Or maybe the universe finally became tired of watching her lose. The building looked forgotten by time itself. Paper covered the windows. The paint was peeling. Half the sign above the entrance had fallen apart years ago. But something about it felt alive underneath the decay. Loretta sat in her car, staring at the building while rain tapped softly against the windshield. Then she noticed the for sale sign. She almost drove away. Almost. Instead, she called the number. Miss Delia Pratt answered on the 3rd ring. 84 years old. Living in a nursing home outside Decatur. Tired of paying taxes on a building nobody wanted. Loretta asked the price. $31,000. Loretta swallowed hard. Then quietly offered $21. Every dollar she had left. Miss Delia accepted before Loretta finished speaking. The paperwork was signed 2 days later. When Loretta received the keys, her hands trembled slightly. Not because she felt confident. Because she didn't. This wasn't courage. Courage feels clean. This felt terrifying. The first afternoon inside the restaurant, she walked slowly through every room with a flashlight and a legal pad. Dust covered everything. Broken chairs leaned against walls. The kitchen smelled like old grease and rust. Most of the equipment looked ancient. But beneath the damage, the bones were good. Strong. Still standing. Loretta moved toward the back hallway. That's when she noticed the storage room door. Paint chipped. Handle rusted. She almost ignored it. Instead she pushed it open. The smell hit her immediately. Dust. Wood. Old paper. And something else underneath it all she couldn't quite recognize. The room was dark except for weak kitchen light spilling across the floor behind her. Loretta stepped carefully between stacked boxes and broken furniture. Then she saw the wooden crates, covered beneath a stained canvas tarp against the back wall. Something about them pulled her closer. She reached down and lifted the cloth. Dust exploded into the air. And there they were. 31 glass bottles sealed with faded red wax. Every single one labeled by hand. Loretta picked one up slowly. Then froze. Estelle May Carter. New Orleans, Louisiana. Her grandmother's name. Loretta stared at the bottle for a very long time without moving. The world around her disappeared. Suddenly she was 12 years old. Again standing inside a tiny kitchen in Treme. While jazz music drifted through open windows and her grandmother stirred peppers inside a cast iron pot. "You smell that?" Estelle once asked her. Loretta nodded. "Remember it," her grandmother said softly. "People forget faces. They forget promises too. But they never forget how something made them feel." Back in the storage room, Loretta's eyes filled slowly with tears. She looked at the remaining bottles. 31 jars. 31 pieces of a past she thought had vanished forever. And beneath the crate sat an old weathered folder. Loretta opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten invoices, letters, restaurant orders, business agreements, and one document that changed everything. The rights to Treme Original Hot Sauce. Legally assigned to Estelle May Carter and all direct heirs. Loretta read the page twice. Then a third time. Her breathing slowed. For the first time since the divorce, something inside her shifted. Not hope. Not yet. But something close to it. The next morning she visited an attorney on Auburn Avenue. The lawyer adjusted her glasses while reading through the documents carefully. Then finally looked up. "Mrs. Hayes," she said quietly, "your grandmother protected this before you even got married." Loretta frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "These agreements were signed 6 years before your marriage. Under Georgia law, inherited intellectual property transferred before marriage is separate ownership." Loretta stared at her. The lawyer smiled softly. "This belongs to you. Entirely." Loretta leaned back in the chair speechless. Calvin spent 2 years making sure she walked away with nothing. And somehow, he missed the one thing that mattered most. Over the next several weeks, Loretta learned the truth about Treme Original. Her grandmother's sauce had once been quietly legendary. Throughout parts of Louisiana, small restaurants ordered it for years. Local chefs tried recreating the flavor and failed. People remembered it decades later. And one man had spent 3 years searching for the surviving rights owner. Rowan Dupree, founder of Dupree Food Group, owner of multiple Creole restaurants across the South. The first time Loretta met Rowan, she expected another businessman like Calvin. Polished. Cold. Transactional. Instead, Rowan asked her a strange question before discussing money. "What did your grandmother's kitchen smell like on Sundays?" Loretta blinked. Then answered without thinking. "Cayenne pepper, butter, and something sweet underneath it." Rowan smiled slowly. "My grandmother's kitchen smelled the same." For the first time in months, Loretta felt someone speaking to her like a human being instead of a legal problem. Rowan explained that Treme Original had become almost mythical in certain culinary circles. Authentic. Impossible to duplicate. Real. He offered her a partnership instead of a buyout. Her name. Her grandmother's recipes. His distribution network. Equal ownership. Loretta didn't answer immediately. She spent the night staring at her grandmother's recipe book. Inside the tiny apartment she now rented. Then she opened to the very first page. A small handwritten sentence sat in the corner beside an old gumbo recipe. "If the door opens, walk through it." The next morning she called Rowan. And everything changed. But Calvin Hayes wasn't finished taking from her. Not yet. He learned about Treme Original through their daughter Camille. For months Camille called Loretta pretending to check on her, asking careful questions. How's the building? Ein business plans? Have you spoken to investors? Loretta answered honestly every time. Because she was still her daughter. What Loretta didn't know. Every conversation was being forwarded directly to Calvin. The lawsuit arrived 2 months later. Calvin claimed the brand was discovered during ongoing divorce proceedings, and therefore qualified as marital property. Loretta sat silently in her lawyer's office reading the paperwork. Every page felt familiar. The same manipulation. The same greed. The same belief that everything in her life could eventually become his. That night Calvin called her personally. Loretta stared at his name glowing on her phone screen for nearly a minute before answering. Loretta, he said softly. Like he still had the right to say her name that way. We don't need to fight over this. She remained silent. I'm only asking for what's fair. Something inside Loretta finally broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just permanently. You took 30 years of my life, she said quietly. You planned my destruction while sleeping beside me every night. Calvin sighed heavily. You're being emotional. Loretta almost laughed. No, she whispered. This is the first time I'm not. Then she hung up. At the hearing, the judge reviewed the timeline carefully. The inheritance documents. The trademark agreements. The dates. Then she looked directly at Calvin's attorney. Challenge dismissed. Just like that. One sentence. Calvin lost. But the real damage came afterward. Because the court filings became public. And once investigators began reviewing Calvin's business structures, other victims started talking. Former partners. Clients. Investors. A pattern emerged. Asset manipulation. Fraudulent transfers. Shell structures designed to hide ownership. Even Calvin's son, Devin, had signed several documents investigators now considered evidence. The empire Calvin spent 30 years building began collapsing piece by piece. Clients disappeared first. Then investors. Then licenses. Then the woman he left. Loretta quietly packed her things and vanished. The same week federal investigators arrived at his office. People like her never loved the man. Only the life surrounding him. And Calvin no longer had one. Meanwhile, Loretta rebuilt hers. Slowly. Carefully. Honestly. Treme on Edgewood opened 8 months later. The line stretched down the block opening night. The smell alone stopped people on the sidewalk. Cayenne. Butter. Garlic. Memory. Inside the restaurant, every table filled within minutes. People laughed loudly. Music drifted through the dining room. And for the first time in decades, Loretta felt visible. Not because someone finally gave her permission to matter. Because she finally understood she always did. Before opening the doors that night, Loretta carried one final thing into the kitchen. A framed photograph. Her grandmother standing proudly in front of her tiny New Orleans kitchen holding 2 bottles of Treme Original in her hands. Loretta hung it beside the kitchen entrance herself. Then stepped back quietly. Ruthie Bowman stood nearby watching her. Ruthie had once worked inside Loretta's old home for 14 years before. Calvin fired her through a text message. Now she managed the front of the restaurant. With full benefits in her name. Proudly displayed on the office door. You ready? Ruthie asked. Loretta looked around the kitchen slowly. Steam rising from fresh food. Employees moving quickly. Her grandmother's recipes alive again after decades. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile she spent 30 years giving strangers. A real one. Yeah, she whispered. I think I finally am. That night, while customers filled every seat inside the restaurant, Calvin Hayes sat alone inside a 1-bedroom apartment outside. Marietta staring at legal documents spread across a cheap kitchen table. Federal investigations. License suspensions. Debt notices. His phone barely rang anymore. Nobody needed him now. And for the first time in his life, he understood exactly what loneliness felt like. Meanwhile, Loretta stood inside a crowded restaurant, built from the ashes of everything he tried to destroy. He took the house. He took the cars. He took the money. But he never understood the one thing he couldn't steal. Where she came from. Some people spend their entire lives chasing ownership. Property. titles, accounts. But the things truly worth having can't always be signed away on paper. A recipe, a legacy, a story, a grandmother's love bottled carefully into 31 forgotten jars waiting patiently for the right hands to find them. And sometimes, the people who leave you with nothing accidentally leave you with everything. Because they were too blind to recognize your real value while they still had you. And by the time they finally understand, it's already too late.